September 17th, 1943. They laughed at his rifle the moment he stepped into the rain, because it was old, rusted at the edges, and looked more like a forgotten hunting relic than a weapon of war. And the men watching from the warm wooden guard tower whispered to each other that if this was the best the resistance could send, then the night would be their easiest victory yet. But what none of them understood as the cold wind pushed through the pine trees and the clouds swallowed the moon was that the rifle in his hands had already tasted more truth than any modern gun ever would, and the man holding it, a quiet figure named Elias Krell before the war shattered his name into dust, had not come to win a battle, had not even come to survive. He had come to end a story that had begun when his brother's body was carried back on a tarp soaked in red, his village burned into whispers, and his mother buried in a shallow, unmarked grave by men who never learned her name. And now, as the first drop of rain slid down the wooden stock of his rifle, as the mud softened beneath his boots and swallowed his weight into a silence that only he and the earth understood, 78 soldiers trained, armed, confident were about to learn that weapons do not make legends, grief does, and laughter, when heard by the wrong man, can be the last sound a person ever makes, because Elias had been walking for 3 days through tree lines broken by artillery, past fields split open like old wounds, through villages where doors hung on one hinge and clocks still ticked inside empty walls, not to hunt an army but to hunt a moment, the one precise moment where 100 small choices, 100 small errors, would stack like bones and create the perfect opening for one quiet, broken man to walk in and erase an entire night from history, and the guards above him, who had been joking in half-drunk voices and passing a flask between trembling gloves, never noticed the way the birds had gone silent, never noticed the wind shift east instead of west, never noticed that the dogs further down the road refused to bark because nature had already recognized what humanity hadn't. Death was arriving, and it walked like a shadow without fear, and when Elias finally lifted the rifle to his shoulder, his breath slow, steady. The memory of his brother's voice not yelling but laughing in that old golden afternoon by the river, when nothing in the world felt sharp yet, filled his mind for just half a second, and then the first shot cracked through the darkness, sharp and final, punched through the rain like a declaration, and the man in the tower dropped before his mind even had time to understand the sound had come from the forest. Because Elias did not fire like an angry man, he fired like a man correcting a mistake made long ago, and as the body hit the wood with a sickening thud, the laughing in the tower stopped, replaced by confusion, then panic, then boots scrambling, and the second shot arrived before the first alarm bell could even be touched, another body collapsing like wood chopped mid-sentence. And suddenly the base that had been operating like a machine became a storm of shouting, lights flickering on, shadows running into each other, rifles lifted toward trees that no longer looked like trees but like 1,000 hiding places. And Elias moved not fast, not slow, but with the patience of someone who had already spent 2 years waiting for 1 hour to finally arrive, crawling through mud, pressing his body into the wet earth, moving only when the thunder rolled to hide the sound of his breath, every movement measured, every step a choice between noise and silence, between life and legacy, because he had learned long ago during the first winter of the war, when hunger had twisted the village into ghosts, that the loudest man always died first, and tonight he planned to be quieter than anyone had ever been, and from the side of the base where the fuel trucks sat like sleeping animals, he took down another, then another, shadows dropping without warning, helmets rolling into puddles, the reflection of the moon shattering in the water as if even the sky wished not to witness what was happening below. And now the soldiers weren't laughing, they weren't even shouting, they were trembling, firing wildly into darkness that answered only with more darkness, unaware that each flash from their guns painted their own position, each bullet a signal flare, and Elias, steady as a machine that had found its rhythm, began moving through them like a rumour, one moment unseen, the next moment standing directly behind a man who felt a cold breath before he ever felt the end. And all around the base, chaos bloomed, sirens choking the air, orders in broken voices colliding into meaninglessness, because no one could understand how one man could unmake an entire system that had been built by generals and architects. But they had never watched a whole world burn and then walked alone through the smoke, learning that fear is a resource that can be shaped like steel if you hold it long enough. And as his count in his head passed 20, then 30, then 40, there was still no joy in his face, no satisfaction, only the quiet, hollow focus of someone finishing a task that had been written in his bones long before any uniform ever touched his skin, and somewhere between the 43rd and 52nd, he heard a boy's voice call out for his mother in a language he did not understand, and for a heartbeat his hands froze, because the war had taught him to stop hearing that word at all, had buried it so deep that even memory struggled to find it. But he allowed himself no pause, no mercy for moments that could become doors back into softness, because tonight was not made for mercy, it was made for reckoning, and as the clock above the command office clicked toward midnight, each passing minute seemed to drop another body into silence like a tally, being carved into stone by an invisible hand, and the base, which had once been alive with movement, now felt like a breath being slowly crushed out of a chest too weak to fight back, and each step he took forward felt lighter than the last, as if the earth itself were recognizing him as something no longer fully human but not yet gone either. And when he reached the ammunition storehouse and placed the final small package beneath its wooden beams, his fingers barely trembling, he did not run. He walked away into the tree line, turned one last time to look at the place that had stolen so many names from the world, and whispered, not a prayer, not a curse, but a simple, broken, honest farewell to the life he would never get back. And when the explosion finally tore open the night and fire rushed into the sky like a furious sun reborn at the wrong hour, the shockwave bending trees and shattering glass, the remaining few who survived would later swear there had been dozens of attackers, that they had seen entire squads moving through the forest, that shadows had spoken and the earth itself had opened its mouth, because the idea of one man was too terrifying, too impossible, too close to the truth that war is never fought between armies alone. It is carried out by single hearts that have run out of places to heal, and as the flames climbed higher and the rain hissed against them, as the night screamed and then finally grew still, no one could see the figure moving away into darkness on the other side of the river, rifle now resting against his back like a tired companion, his count stopping somewhere between 75 and 80, because after a certain number, they are no longer enemies, they are only echoes, and Elias Krell disappeared into that forest the same way he had entered it, unheard, unseen, unrecorded, leaving behind nothing but questions, disbelief, and a silence so heavy that even the surviving birds refused to sing when the sun finally rose over what used to be a base, and was now nothing more than a blackened scar on the earth's trembling skin, September 18th, 1943. By the time the sun struggled up over the horizon, pale and unsure, the world refused to believe what the scorched ground beneath the smoke was quietly confessing, because when the first reconnaissance unit arrived at the blackened remains of the outpost, stepping carefully around twisted metal and half-burned crates, the silence was so complete that even the birds that normally returned with morning were nowhere to be found, and the men moved with a strange reverence, as if stepping into the remains of a chapel instead of a military base, their boots crunching over debris that had once been walls, once been desks, once been the place where laughter had echoed hours earlier, and no one spoke at first because the numbers simply did not make sense. The damage too precise, the bodies too spaced, the angles of collapse too deliberate, like the handwriting of someone who had not just destroyed but had written a message in flame, and the officer in charge, a man who had survived 3 campaigns and had watched entire towns fall without the slightest change in his expression, stared down at the ground and removed his gloves slowly, his fingers trembling for reasons he refused to address, because there were no signs of a large invasion, no tracks of many boots, no indication of retreating troops, only scattered footprints half filled with rain, leading toward the forest and stopping as if the person who made them had simply dissolved into air. And when the count began, when names were matched to faces and confirmations were tied to silence, the whispers started, not from soldiers but from deep inside the human part of them that feared stories more than facts, because 78 men, trained, equipped, guarded behind fences and lights and protocols, had been erased in a single night without a formal charge, without a declared assault, and the word that no one dared say aloud began to travel in half-formed thoughts from one side of the camp to the other, ghost, phantom, shadow, and even the generals who later ruled it an unrecorded resistance attack could not bring themselves to put that number on paper, reduced it, altered it, made the truth more manageable, because history only feels safe when it is made smaller than reality. And yet the rumours that drifted through nearby villages grew larger instead. Villagers who claimed to have seen a lone figure crossing the river at sunrise, soaked through, moving with the quiet determination of a man whose journey was not ending but only bending into a different shape, and the old woman who sold bread at the fork of the road would swear on her last living tooth that she had watched him stop by the stream, rinse the dirt from his hands and stare at his own reflection, as if learning what kind of creature he had become. And for one flicker of a moment, just one, his eyes had betrayed him, because in that mirrored surface he did not see a warrior, did not see a hero or a saviour. He saw a boy standing by the riverbank years earlier, holding a fishing line, hearing his brother laugh behind him, still believing that the world, no matter how cruel, contained a shape of mercy somewhere inside it, and that memory stung sharper than any wound he carried, because bodies healed and grief did not. And as he moved deeper into the woods, each branch brushing his coat like a reminder that the earth still acknowledged his existence, he could feel the weight of the night settling into him, not as triumph, but as a quiet, heavy truth that could not be spoken to anyone, not written, not confessed, only carried like a second heartbeat counting time in a different language. And yet elsewhere, far removed from the scent of smoke and sap, men in clean uniforms examined photographs taken that morning, circled areas on maps, compared angles, distances, fragments, and for the first time in our very long time, fear crept up the walls of rooms that had never known it, because nothing terrifies those who control systems more than the idea that a single broken man, armed only with memory and patience, could dismantle years of planning in silence, and questions that could not be asked directly began to linger in the air of offices and command rooms. Who trained him? Where did he come from? Who else was with him? And when all reasonable answers failed, the unreasonable ones gained ground until his name, a name he had not spoken in years, was written on a thin classified sheet that would later be sealed beneath official records. A name that meant nothing to anyone in that room, Elias Kriel, accompanied by a grainy photograph taken long before war had carved lines into his face. And the annotation beneath it was simple yet trembling with unease, reading, "Subject displays abnormal patience, abnormal precision, and an absence of fear commonly associated with personal loss rather than political allegiance. And so while soldiers cleaned ruins and tried to rebuild meaning out of debris, something far more dangerous was happening somewhere else, because the idea of him had begun to grow, separating from the man himself, transforming into a story, and stories, unlike men, could not be cornered or captured. They slipped into taverns, into train compartments, into whispers between mothers and children, into the distant imaginations of those who wished for justice that uniforms had never delivered. And he had become, without ever choosing to, the quiet face of a different kind of resistance, one not led by flags or leaders, but by loss. And as days turned into another restless night, and the war continued its mechanical chewing of time and flesh elsewhere across the world, no one could see the figure seated at the edge of a forgotten village, sharing a piece of bread with a small trembling dog that had followed him out of the trees, his fingers resting on the animal's head, as if remembering how to touch something living again without harm. And in that moment, in the shallow breath before dawn, even he did not know whether he was finished with the war, or whether the war, having tasted his existence, had only just begun to follow him, because across an ocean of maps and decisions, another file was opened, another pin dropped on another chart, and somewhere in clean, bright ink beneath dates and numbers and cold official language, a new heading was written. The man with the old rifle priority subject and the world, so eager to control and categorize, did not yet understand that once a man has nothing left to lose, no system in existence can ever truly own him again. October 3rd, 1943. The hunt for a man who no longer thought of himself as a man had begun in earnest, and the irony of it was that Elias Krell, who had spent so much of his life trying to disappear into ordinary air, now found that the world had sharpened its eyes just for him, because throughout nearby towns, across fractured roads, and deep into the damp lungs of the forest, posters that bore a version of his face, younger, unbroken, almost gentle, had started to appear, curling at the corners, catching the curious and the fearful in equal measure, and beneath the image were lines of text that made people look away quickly, as if even reading them might bring the shadow of him too close. Yet they read them anyway, because fear has always lived side by side with fascination, and every tavern, every market, every train compartment whispered variations of the same uncertain myth. One man, one night, an entire base erased, and whether they spoke of him as monster, hero, or nightmare depended entirely on where their grief had planted itself in their hearts. And Elias felt the shift in the world without needing to see any notice or hear any rumour, because the wind had begun to change its mind about him, carrying unfamiliar tensions, strange silences between the rustling leaves, unfamiliar footsteps that stopped when he stopped and started again when he moved. And it was in that awareness, more than anything, that he knew he had entered a new chapter, not just of war, but of himself. For all his life he had existed on the edges of crowds, a quiet observer, a helper in the background, a presence that no one noticed until it was missing, and now he was being looked for by men who had never once cared whether he lived or died before. And the world, so efficient at ignoring one kind of suffering, had suddenly grown desperate to understand another, because his actions had embarrassed systems larger than sense, and powerful things do not like to be made small by something human and quiet. And so the hunters came in uniforms darker than night, boots made to crush ground into obedience, eyes trained to find patterns where none should exist, and dogs were released into forest lines, their noses trembling with purpose, their handlers confident that instinct and discipline could always overpower sorrow and memory. Yet what they did not understand is that Elias was no longer guided by logic as they knew it. He was guided by something older and more broken. The kind of instinct that does not run from danger but rearranges itself around it, the way water curves around stone, and as he moved through abandoned farmhouses and narrow river paths, his mind did not replay the night of fire, did not celebrate nor re-examine it. Instead it returned, again and again, to a memory that had nothing to do with war. A small wooden classroom, dust floating in sunlight, a voice speaking about history as if it were something stable, something written and finished, his teacher as hand resting on a book that claimed men could change the world through power and strategy. And he remembered how he had once believed that to be true, remembered how easily ideas had found a home in a mind that had never known, how violently those same ideas could later be carved into flesh, and this memory haunted him more than the faces of the fallen, because it reminded him that he had once been someone who might have lived a life of quiet purpose. Perhaps a teacher, perhaps a father, perhaps just another man walking by the same river every day until time slowly folded him into the earth, and yet that man had been taken long before the rifle ever touched his shoulder, and the realization settled into him with a strange clarity. The true theft of war was not life, but identity, carving people into shapes they never agreed to become, and as those thoughts wound through him like cold threads, he reached the edges of a forgotten town where the houses leaned into each other like tired conspirators and the streets had long surrendered to weeds and rain. And it was there, in the broken doorway of a place that had once sold bread, that he found her, a young woman seated among the dust and grey, holding a notebook in her hands as if it might shield her from the world, her eyes lifting not in fear as he had expected, nor in anger, but in quiet recognition, as if she had been waiting for him the way one waits for a change in weather. And when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the way tragedy hung from her shoulders like an invisible shawl, and she said his name without question, Elias, not as a command, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of truth, and the sound of it stilled him in a way no bullet ever could, because no one had said it in months, and fewer still had said it without demanding something in return, and in that moment the myth surrounding him cracked just enough for the man beneath to breathe again, and she told him she'd been documenting disappearances, families lost between borders and orders and uniforms, writing stories that history intended to bury, and she had followed his trail not as a hunter but as a witness, not to capture him, but to understand what the world was trying to erase. And he listened, at first suspicious, then slowly realizing that of all the people who now sought him for power or punishment, she was the only one who had come to him armed with nothing but truth and ink, and the weight of that recognition was heavier than any weapon he'd carried. Because somewhere in the quiet part of his mind, buried deep beneath years of controlled silence, he had once believed that if the world ever understood how he had been made, how he had been shaped by loss rather than hatred, it might no longer see him as a monster or a miracle, but as a consequence. And consequences, unlike heroes, did not ask to be worshipped or destroyed. They simply existed as evidence that something had gone terribly wrong long before their arrival, and the young woman, her notebook resting open now as if awaiting a final sentence, asked him not what he had done, not how many had fallen, but why he had chosen to keep living after everything had been taken, and the simplicity of the question struck him deeper than any interrogation ever could, because he had never once allowed himself to consider that survival itself had been a choice, an act, perhaps even a form of defiance. And in the silence that stretched between them, broken only by the distant sound of dogs barking somewhere far away in the world he no longer belonged to, Elias finally answered not for her, not for the record she wished to create, but for the boy he used to be, telling her in a voice stripped raw of armour that he had not chosen to live for revenge, nor for country, nor for justice dressed in grand words, but simply because in a world determined to erase him, his continued breath was the only rebellion left. And as the sound of approaching boots began to echo faintly through the ruins, louder now, undeniable, both of them understood that the moment of stillness had passed, and the world was once again demanding an answer in movement and consequence. And as he turned toward the back of the building with the intention of disappearing once more into darkness and distance, she said one final thing that rooted him to the ground, words so quiet they almost vanished before reaching him, yet powerful enough to alter the architecture of his fate. They can hunt you forever unless you become something they can erase, and those words carried a meaning larger than escape, larger than survival, larger even than war, because in them lived an alternative, He had never considered not the path of destruction, but transformation, not the role of shadow, but of voice. And somewhere inside him, a new possibility, fragile but undeniable, began to form, even as the world closed in around their fragile moment. And for the first time since his life shattered, Elias Krell did not ask himself how much longer he could keep running, but instead asked a far more dangerous question. What if, instead of disappearing, he chose to be seen October 21st, 1943? Becoming visible was far more terrifying than disappearing had ever been, because as Elias Krell stood on the ridge overlooking the narrow valley, where soldiers now poured in like dark water seeking a shape to fill, he realized that a man could vanish 1,000 times and still be hunted. But the moment he chose to exist on his own terms, the world would be forced to decide what to make of him. And beneath the pale bruised sky, as the wind pulled at the hem of his coat, and the distant thunder of approaching engines stirred the earth like a warning heartbeat, he finally understood the truth that had been clawing its way through his chest for weeks. Survival was never the end of anything. It was only the beginning of a reckoning, and somewhere behind him, that young woman with the notebook had hidden herself among broken stones, still watching, still writing, still believing that stories could outlive violence, and in front of him, an entire system hungry to either claim him or destroy him, loud with certainty and armoured with fear, moved closer, calling out orders into the open air as if the air itself could be commanded. And in that instant, as the first line of men reached the base of the ridge, Elias did not raise his rifle, did not move to flee, did not even reach for the familiar comfort of the weapon that had once felt like an extension of his arm, because he finally understood something. Neither side could comprehend the night he had erased 78 men was not meant to create another cycle of blood. It was meant to end the one he'd been locked inside, and so he did the only thing truly unknown in war. He stepped forward, out of the trees, out of shadow, out of myth, into full view of disbelief, and the valley froze, rifles hesitating, jaws stiffening, fingers trembling on triggers, because no one had prepared them for a man who walked toward them, unarmed, eyes hollow yet unwavering, face marked not by rage but by a terrible calm clarity. And in the seconds that followed, time seemed to hold its breath as he descended slowly down the slope, each step echoing a decision the past could not undo, but the future might still forgive. And in that trembling space between chaos and surrender, Elias spoke, his voice carrying across the valley in a way sound rarely does, not shouted, not declared, but offered, a voice filled with the weight of every unsent letter and every unspoken goodbye. And he said that he had not come to fight anymore, that he had not come to justify or to beg, that he was the sum of a world that had destroyed itself a little at a time, and that if they wished to end him, they could, but that no bullet they ever fired would be as loud as the silence this war had already placed inside its survivors. And those words, so plain, so devastatingly human, rippled through the men before him in a way no command ever could, because war had trained them to react to movement, to attack, to resist, but it had never taught them how to face someone who refused to play the final scene they had prepared for. And somewhere behind rows of doubt and disbelief, an officer stepped forward, a man whose face held both authority and something like exhaustion, and he ordered Elias to kneel, to surrender, to name the others who had helped him, and for the first time since he had become a story instead of a person, Elias smiled faintly, not with mockery but with understanding, and he said simply that there had never been any others, that the world was much more frightening once you accepted how much damage a single broken human heart could do when it had been pushed far enough, and a murmur spread through the valley, fear transforming now into something quieter, something more introspective, because in that moment, the legend they had been hunting no longer felt like a monster, it felt like a mirror, and the uncertainty of what to do with him settled in their hands, heavier than any rifle. And the young woman watching from the stones realized then that the final chapter of his story was no longer about how many had fallen, but how many might rise from the awareness he had forced into the open. And though records would later claim he was taken into custody, his trail lost behind walls and ink and politics, the truth slipped through cracks like light, because none of the men on that ridge could later agree on what had actually happened next. Some swore he was led away in chains, others claimed he walked off alone once the order was given to stand down. A few whispered that he had vanished again, dissolving into the trees as if the earth itself had claimed him as its own. But what every single witness agreed upon, even those who wished they didn't remember it, was that as he turned away, whether toward freedom or confinement, he looked back just once, not at the soldiers, not at the weapons, not at the machines of war surrounding him, but toward the distant outline of the village lost in the hills, and in that look lived an entire lifetime, a childhood beneath open skies, a brother's laughter, a mother's hands, a world that had once been gentle before it had learned how to break itself. And the young woman, heart pounding as she watched the place where he had stood empty itself of him, wrote her final sentence with trembling fingers, knowing that the world might never read it in full truth, and yet writing it anyway, because that was the only resistance left to her, and she wrote that history would one day describe him in numbers and rumours, in classified documents and half-truths, but that she had seen him as he truly was, not a legend, not a weapon, not a ghost, but a man shaped by loss who had chosen, in the end, to return a piece of his humanity to a world that had almost completely forgotten its own. And decades later, when the war had long turned into pages in thick books and names carved on stone, old men in small villages would still lower their voices when speaking of a night when laughter died in a tower, and a single figure walked into darkness carrying an old rifle, and children would ask if he'd been a hero or a villain, and no one ever answered the same, because the truth had become something larger than the man himself, something that did not belong to sides, only to memory, and in the quietest corner of a forgotten museum, behind glass kissed by dust, sat a rusted rifle with a small faded label. No guide ever lingered on long enough to explain, and beneath it, written in simple, almost merciful words, were the only lasting records of his existence. This belonged to a man the world could not agree on, only remember, and in that final uncertain sentence, Elias Krell, the man they once laughed at, who changed an entire night and then vanished, into time, was allowed at last to become what he had always longed for, not feared, not worshipped, not hunted, but simply finally understood.